Hello, good afternoon, and good morning for those who are listening to us. And thank you for joining us today with some salient human rights risks mining companies are exposed to. My name is Mariano Machado, and I'm a senior political analyst for the Americas team here at Verisk Maplecroft. And I'll be moderating the webinar today from the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'll give a brief introduction to Verisk Maplecroft and provide a little housekeeping, and then I'll hand things over to my colleagues. For background, Maplecroft specializes in quantifying risk exposure on a global scale, focusing on four thematic areas: political risks, human rights, environment and climate change, and economics. Our data and expertise and unique holistic approach support a broad array of multinational and investor clients across a variety of different functions and roles in assessing above-ground, non-technical risk, performing supplier and site risk assessment, conducting in-depth due diligence, and strengthening portfolio management. Now, I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists: Jimena Blanco, Research Director and Head of the Americas, and Victoria Gama, Senior Human Rights Analyst. But before I hand over to them, we have a few items of housekeeping to quickly touch on. Firstly, your microphones are mute by default for the duration of the webinar. However, you can use the chat panel to send us questions at any time. If you are viewing this in full screen mode, this can be found via the drop-down panel that appears when your mouse is at the top of your screen. Otherwise, it should be on the right-hand side of your WebEx window. Please note that to ask your question anonymously, you should have the host and presenter option selected before sending your question. Otherwise, all participants will see the question and who is it from. Secondly, we will try to answer as many questions as possible with the time remaining at the end of the presentation, but if we run out of time and we don't get to your question, no worries, we will coordinate a follow-up response with you after the session. And finally, please don't worry about furiously scribbling down any notes. Our webinar recording and the presentation slides will be made available to you via email in the coming days. Just to note that due to new GDPR regulation, if you have selected Do Not Email on any Maplecroft forms, unfortunately, we will not be able to send you the slides of today's presentation, but you can change this going into your settings, or you can get in touch with us directly at info@maplecroft.com if you'd like to receive this. So that's the end of housekeeping. During the roughly next half an hour, we will be dealing with the intricacies behind Latin America's socio-environmental conflicts and how closely related to the mining industry they are. To better organize the presentation, during the first part, Jimena will be covering the context of an SLO to operate in Latin America and the most salient risks they have identified toward indices, and talked about specific cases of study of failing to secure SLO. Then, Victoria will cover cases of success, what are the challenges laying ahead, and which tools companies have available to prevent, mitigate, and remediate SLO-associated risks. So, Jimena, why has securing and maintaining an SLO become a problem for mining companies operating in Latin America?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mariano, for the introduction. As you mentioned, over the next half an hour, we'll try to cover a variety of issues, and I'll start by looking at the context, that is the complex process to secure social license to operate in Latin America for the mining industry. I guess to answer your question, we should start by understanding or identifying how we define social license. So we understand SLO as the ability of a company to understand and factor in community expectations when they're making decisions. And in order, this has to be done in order to gain legitimacy and credibility to operate. And really, this has become a must-have in the region because it will determine whether an operator can access or secure investment, whether it can deploy the capital effectively, and in turn deliver the returns that their stockholders expect. Without an SLO, mining projects are often suspended, sometimes for a short period of time, but in the more extreme examples, they can also be cancelled. So, going back to, why has there been so many issues? Well, first of all, the industry is probably the most exposed to SLO issues in the region. It has witnessed the highest number of active socio-environmental conflicts globally. And these can take the forms of disruptive protests, of claims before tribunals, of demands from communities for popular referenda. It can also be shown in requests to gain free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous communities, and also in the form of lobbying by activists and local communities for specific regulatory reforms and the establishment of new regulatory frameworks. In Latin America specifically, we have looked at the 9 largest mining countries and the number of socio-environmental conflicts present in these countries. In total, there are 714 conflicts in these 9 countries, and of these, 340 are relating to the metals and mining industry. So it's clearly, an industry that's highly exposed to the issue. Now, taking into account the cases we looked at in these particular countries, on average, operators can lose up to $900 million per project, either in the form of operational costs or investment costs. And some of the specific ways in which SLO or the lack of SLO manifests itself includes labor strikes. It also includes protests linked to requests to safeguard water resources and land from pollution. And in these latter cases or examples are the ones driving the majority of cases of community opposition in Peru, in Argentina, and in Colombia.
Definitely on point to the mining industry, but if I may ask Jimena, concretely, what are the key risks associated with the social license to operate that you have detected?
Well, we've taken a sample of our more than 150 risk indices, and we selected 6 that speak volumes on the impact that mining activities can have on surrounding communities. Now, we produced an aggregate index score based on these issues, and this shows that in 8 out of 9 Latin American countries, there is a high risk exposure in issues which are central to companies obtaining social license to operate and to maintaining the SLO as well. This includes indigenous and labor rights and security forces violations. In the case of indigenous rights, we can see that it's a high or extreme risk issue in every single jurisdiction, even in Chile, which scores favorably in all other measures. Breaking down the issues a bit further, we can see that labor risks, corruption, civil unrest, and violation by the security forces all pose a high risk across most countries in our sample. And these risks also add to concerns around water quality and water availability, which bring in higher regulatory costs for operators, sometimes in the form of debates over the reforming the water codes. We've seen an example, an ongoing debate in Chile. Also calls for the introduction of new environmental impact assessments. Again, we've seen that example in Chile as well. And it can also bring operational and reputational costs for operators, particularly when communities decide to take direct action against the projects.
That is very interesting. So you've just mentioned the risk associated for mining companies to secure and maintain SLO. Can you give us an example of projects that failed to secure their SLO?
Of course. I mean, I think, this is a case study that's quite famous, or we could say infamous, for the level of conflict experienced by the Conga project in Peru. For us, it's a case that brings together issues around the negative legacy of the mining industry in the area, but also a poor management of legal, environmental, and community expectations around the project. So to give you a bit of context, Conga mine was Peru's largest ever mining investment project with a disbursement of around $4.8 billion. But in 2016, because of concerns related to access to safe and affordable water, concerns around threats to biodiversity, claims of a lack of free, prior, and informed consent, and violations of land and property rights, there was a series of incidents in which there was excessive use of force, both by private and by local law enforcement agencies. And this resulted in the murder or the killing of 5 local community members. And so in the end, the project was cancelled. But I was mentioning earlier how it was in the context of a negative legacy, and this has to do with the fact that just 50 kilometers away, the community had for a long time experienced what it saw as negative impacts of the Yanacocha mine, which began in the early 90s as a joint venture between Newmont, Sumitomo, and Buenaventura. And once the companies have reached the stage of all at war with communities in any project, restoring the trust can take many years and active investment in community relations and in outreach programs. So in the case of Yanacocha, the operation had been facing challenges since the late 90s when environmentalist organizations and in the surrounding areas of the mine had been documenting pollution incidents linked to the operation. And this included the death of local fisheries and also the poisoning and intoxication with polluting minerals of 9 workers. So after years of having witnessed the effects of the Yanacocha's activities on the traditional livelihoods and the local way of life, communities were very quick to oppose the development of the Conga mine, which, as I said, was very close geographically to Yanacocha.
I see. That's very interesting. So would you say that the cancellation of the project was only a consequence of legacy mining?
Well, not really. I think, legacy mining does explain partially the cancellation of the project, and it did contribute to the community's opposition. But at the end of the day, we consider that, there was a failure to conduct participatory processes to address community concerns. So if we think about the nature of the local community and the region, Cajamarca is the 4th most populated region in Peru. It's also the 2nd largest cattle raising region in the country. And the majority of its population, so over 2/3 of the population, live in rural areas. And for them, agriculture and cattle raising are the main means of subsistence. So the area where Conga sits is a very important headwater for the region, and operations there could impact 5 hydric systems that contribute to the development and the maintenance of these economic activities, as well as local culture and other traditions in nearby provinces. What's interesting about this case is that the peasant communities living in the region identify themselves as indigenous. So for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into the debate of whether they actually, meet the requirements to be considered indigenous or not, and hence whether FPIC should have been obtained. But regardless of whether we decide to consider them indigenous or not, what we argue is that in order to secure and maintain SLO in almost any operation, there needs to be consultation, public hearings, regular dialogue with the community that seriously takes community interests at heart and addresses concerns whenever needed. So in the case of Conga in particular, the Peruvian government attempted to conduct dialogue with local communities on 2 separate occasions. The first one was in January 2004, prior to the beginning of exploration activities. And the second time was in March 2010, once the environmental impact assessment had been approved. Now, The second public hearing did not include some of the key districts where the impacts of the project would have been felt most severely. So it is probable that if a serious participatory process, whether it's in the form of conversations, prior and informed consent processes, a popular consultation, or public hearings, if these processes had been conducted, we would probably have seen a prevention of the escalation that later took place, because the confrontations eventually led to serious protests, the use of excessive force, the declaration of a state of emergency, the arbitrary detention of human rights defenders. And so if the company had focused on building rapport with the community, then we could have seen, even if there was community discontent, a prevention of the level of large-scale protests that we eventually witnessed.
That is very interesting. So, Jimena, you mentioned sources of water as a vital resource for the economic activities of local communities. So, in this case, how did Minera Yanacocha make sure that they prevented any damage to these water resources and to the land?
Well, this is particularly relevant because water was at the heart of the Yanacocha legacy and of the Conga concerns. So the experiences with Yanacocha really had set the bar quite low for the communities, and it set expectations going forward with the Conga project. So as a result of this, the requirement for a serious environmental impact assessment was crucial to securing and maintaining SLO for the new project. But independent investigations conducted by an expert for the Environmental Defender Law Center show that the initial EIA was flawed and biased. According to his findings, there was no detailed hydrogeologic or seismic information for certain lakes. He also found that the EIA provided inconsistent data on the volumes of water that were going to be pumped from the pits. The study also failed to demonstrate that the local and regional groundwater surface water systems were not interconnected and acting as one. And he also found a series of other irregularities, which were later echoed in a 2011 report that the Ministry of Environment submitted to the Chief of Cabinet. So in a nutshell, the project was going to affect water supplies in the region in a drastic manner, and it was going to have an impact on the economic development of not just Cajamarca, but also neighboring regions, Selendín and Hualgayoc. So water was at the heart of this conflict.
Thank you, Jimena. I think that the presentation has evidenced relevant challenges in how SLO can vanish without proper rapport with the community. And now we'll now have Victoria, also in Buenos Aires, to talk us through the remaining parts of the analysis into SLO in Latin America's mining industry. So, Victoria, do we have examples of mining companies that have gotten the message right?
Thanks, Mariano. Yes, we do. And these are the cases that can certainly be replicated in other operations. One case, and you're seeing the picture over there, is San Cristobal mine in Bolivia. It took a while, but finally San Cristobal Mining Company in Bolivia finally nailed it. And the story behind it is a very interesting one, as it shows how a foreign-owned private sector mining company can lose and then regain its social license to operate through various stages and different management processes. At the very beginning, in 1997, Mintec was the company that was operating the mine, and they understood that in order to develop it, they needed to consult the population. So they commenced the consultation process to relocate the community further away from where the mineral deposits laid. Mintec basically gave them free rein to handle all essential aspects related with the relocation, such as the selection of a new town, the design of the houses and the infrastructure surrounding them, and even the design of the benefit packages. with these actions, the community began to feel as associates to the project. So later on, in June 1988, both parties signed an exhaustive agreement over the relocation of the community that included clauses related or really pertinent to the photo that you're seeing over there, which is the chapel that was relocated as well with the community. At the end of 1999, the project was then sold to MSC, and by that time, confidence has been lost, mainly because Mintech failed to fulfill the commitments, and sort of the resettlement the resettlement happened, but not in its entirety, right? Or not as expected by the community, let's say. So then between 2001 and 2004, MSC realized that it needed to stabilize and strengthen their relationship with the communities. So it started again an assistance programs at the end of 2001 with employment for the local community, designing agriculture and tourism activities as well. So slowly credibility started building up again. But again, once again, there's a fall, and mid-2004, a new management takes place to supervise the construction, but had no knowledge whatsoever of the social history of the commitments to the communities. So although there was employment, at least they favored employment for almost the entire local population, social legitimacy disappeared quickly as communities felt that they had been sort of overlooked in the construction phase. So relationships again began to deteriorate and plunged to an all-time low as the new management team believed that they had no time, right, to talk to the community and understand their expectations, as they have a very, very tight construction schedule. So after all, relationships deteriorated so much that the social license was withdrawn and construction was halted by a road blockade. In its final effort, right, to rebuild this relationship with the local community, in October 2006, the company proposed the formation of a community-based process for the design and management of community development program. So this, in a way, legitimized the company. The communities felt heard again. So slowly, we can see there is still a future for San Cristóbal mine in that sense. So in a nutshell, basically, MSC did a couple of things, right? It began with a face-to-face relationship building, identifying key stakeholders. They let them participate, right, and create these commitments in a very creative manner. And whenever something was not going exactly as proposed, the company tried to reach out to them and explain and inform that what was going to be the outcome and discuss that.
Thanks, Victoria. I think that is actually a great case of success that really seems to take into account communities' interests and expectations and makes them work in favor of the mining industry. But so considering the scenario of an uptick in social environmental protests leading to disruption, what does the future of SLO for mining companies looks like, in your opinion?
So, Mariana, we have identified three significant challenges mining companies will likely face in the next 5 years. First of all, an increase in popular consultations rejecting extractive projects. Second, probably the use of strategic litigation to bring claims for violations to human rights in various jurisdictions. And third, a strong civil society that is now seeking for FPEC regulations that are mostly aligned to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights standards. So, for instance, Colombia has already witnessed consultation processes that have categorically rejected mining projects. So in 2017 alone, there were 7 popular consultations that rejected mining projects in the departments of Santander, Meta, Tolima, Cundinamarca, and Quindío. So you see that there's already sort of a battle, right, with mining companies. There was a similar scenario also in Ecuador in March 2018. There was another popular consultation that was sponsored by Yacu Perez and in his campaign trail that voted in favor of banning mining activities in the Girón Canton. And Perez has already taken this triumph sort of as a collective effort, if you want to put it, and is therefore likely to seek to extend this process across Azuay. On the other hand, what we see is we expect an increase in strategic litigation in cases linked to SLO for mining companies as they are reaching other jurisdictions that could bring the cost of naming and shaming up. For example, the case is the confrontation between Newmont Mining Company and the Chaupe family over a plot of land. So after having discussed this and litigated this in domestic tribunals, on March 2018, the case was brought to the Third Circuit of the United States Court of Appeals, which declared that the case presented by the Chaupe family could be heard in the United States based on these allegations of different violations of human rights. And the reason, or the underlying reasoning, was that if the case was going to be heard in Peru, it was likely that they wouldn't be facing a fair trial because of corruption scandals. And lastly, what we anticipate is that civil society in Latin America has become so close-knitted and they have so much communication that it's likely that we're going to see a lot of push and strategizing around how to push for FPIC regulation. The 9 countries we researched had already ratified the ILO 169 convention that obliges to conduct FPICs. So the next step probably for NGOs will be to push for this regulatory framework so that it sort of matches the standards set up by the Inter-American system.
Thank you, Victoria. So basically, you've identified the problem. You have explained us the extent of it and show us case studies and upcoming challenges. But I think there's still one question lingering, which is how can companies prevent scenarios where their SLO is at risk?
So yes, that is the question to answer, right? What we believe is that it's really needed is to conduct a human rights impact assessment. It's the tool that Verisk Maplecroft normally uses in order to assess the baseline of a company's operations in an effort to sort of prevent, mitigate, and remediate ESG risks. So what we do is basically this assessment includes meaningful engagement with large number of stakeholders to try to understand the project's actual and perceived impacts and prioritize in a way remedial actions in line with the interest of the local rights holders. So by doing so, companies can build a richer ecosystem-based approach to project risk management by taking full account of interests of local actors. Verisk Maplecroft has applied this methodology in operations in Africa, North and South America, and has recognized as a best practice, as international practice by the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. So our approach basically is to build basically to align with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and it emphasizes consideration of the severity of the impacts of how companies can have in local populations. So normally we will start with a high-level scan of businesses to identify risk, prioritize where to take additional action, and then what we do is we move on to assess both the potential and actual impacts on stakeholders on the business supply chain, so basically with interviews on the ground. So we identify these key hotspots. We interview ranges of actors that go, of course, governments at provincial, municipal, and national level, but we talk to indigenous communities, NGOs, journalists, in order to have a broad spectrum of stakeholders that might be involved in any sort of way in the project. So by making use of this tool, mining companies in a way can develop a social license strategy that promotes the buy-in of interest groups to attract and safeguard their investment.
Thank you, Victoria. I think this is certainly something worth considering for mining companies when deciding to start exploring. So to wrap up today's webinar, the issues we've covered here indicate the importance of identifying key social and environmental risks that can make mining companies operating in Latin America win or lose their SLO. And we hope this session has provided an indication of how these may affect your businesses, so you can be prepared for those challenges. And now we have a few minutes left to turn to some questions that have come in. I'm seeing one here for Jimena. I think we're going with you first. So the question would be, are there any initiatives that were created from the mining sector, whether as a collaborative effort from chambers or councils or by the companies themselves, to address these issues?
Thanks, Mariano. That's actually a great question, because there has been a lot of drive from the industry recently, and coming directly from both mining associations at the state level as well as by organizations at the international level. So the most comprehensive performance system was designed by the Mining Association of Canada, and it's known as the Towards Sustainable Mining. Aside from covering a wide array of social and environmental risks, it also focuses on indicators around Aboriginal and community outreach, biodiversity conservation management, crisis management and communications planning, energy and GHG emissions management, prevention of child labor, health and safety, tailings management, and water stewardship, amongst others. So it's a very comprehensive system. There is another useful but more limited framework, which are the guidance documents the International Council for Metals and Mining issued to address community development, stakeholder engagement, and strengthening community relations.
That is certainly a great collective effort of recognizing challenges and acting to step up the game in terms of SLO risks. That's very interesting. So here we have another question. This time it's addressed to Victoria. Victoria, do you think that this slow but steady trend of legislation and mandatory reporting on human rights for companies can help create a more transparent and direct report with local communities?
That is a sort of a forward-thinking question, if you want to put it in a way. I believe that in terms of transparency for the broader audience and institutional investors, having this detailed reports on human rights is certainly important to show the efforts made by companies to work alongside local communities. However, the way companies build their relationship with local stakeholders needs to be constant, direct, and emphatic. But just explaining these attempts on paper is never enough. And on the other hand, legislation on mandatory reporting on human rights in the 9 countries we've analyzed is non-existent, or at best on very early stages right now. So for instance, Brazil has issued an executive decree where it clearly states that the guidelines, the United Nations guidelines on business and human rights will be implemented basically voluntarily by companies. It has already caused a lot of havoc among civil society. Argentina, on the other side, is still drafting its National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, so there are no commitments made yet on an agenda for this issue. Colombia and Chile are the most up-to-date with the international set of obligations, as both of them have drafted and are implementing their national action plans. But there is no sign yet of mandatory legislation that will request companies to report on their human rights impact.
Thank you, Victoria. And I think that's the end of today's session. We'll follow up with all of the attendees with a copy of our Human Rights Outlook and a recording of this webinar. Also, just to note, over the next few weeks, we'll be holding other sessions looking at some of the other content in our human rights outlook, focus around climate change and also renewable energy. So if you haven't already, sign up for these, and if you'd like to, please visit the news and events section of our website at maplecroft.com. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to Jimena and Victoria for today's discussion, and of course, thank you to everyone who's joined us for this session. I hope you have a good day, and